Several years ago, I began researching the topic of homosexuality. And as a Bible scholar, I love studying complex topics and figuring out debated issues in Christian theology. So when I started studying what the Bible says about homosexuality, I dove into the Bible commentaries and the scholarly articles, and I did all kinds of studies on Greek and Hebrew words. I basically locked myself up in the ivory tower to solve the issue of homosexuality. But early on in my research, I did something that would change my life. I closed the books, I left my desk, and I started hanging out with LGBT people. I started listening to their stories, and the more I listened to their stories, I started to get to know them as people. I started to empathize with their unique struggles, and my stereotypes were crushed and confronted. And most of all, I found myself enjoying my new friends, who equally and beautifully reflect our Creator's image. Debates about sexuality and gender are not just about issues. They are about people, beautiful people. These debates, they're about my friends.
The way I always start out my story is the way lots of people start out their stories, and that's to say that from the time they were a little kid, they knew they were different.
All of my friends enjoyed having their hair in pigtails and wearing dresses, and I wanted to run around and play Tarzan or play football with the boys. I had absolutely no interest in being a girl.
I hoped and prayed fervently that it would go away, that I would become straight, that I would become what I thought I was supposed to be in order to follow Jesus.
But I knew enough of the Christian world to know that I needed to slam those flickers of attraction toward other women down. They weren't okay. They weren't at all to be talked about.
God was at the center of my emotional and spiritual life, and my own understanding of Jesus and the story of the cross and the story of salvation was the most precious and exciting thing in my life. And so when I realized that there was this thing inside of me, or this spark of a thing, this shadow or suggestion of a thing that might derail that, that was terrifying.
I remember when my parents had the sex talk with me and my brothers, going up to my dad afterwards and asking him, but what about homosexuality? What is that? And I was in 6th grade, and he was like, oh, that's something that people do that we don't talk about or that we don't approve of, and that was it.
Growing up with gender identity questions in the mid-'80s, early '90s was a very frustrating time. Transgenderism wasn't out there, so it was having this horrible feeling that something was wrong, that I didn't feel like I fit in my skin.
The only person I told any of this, that I wasn't attracted to women, that I was attracted to men, I told my brother when I was in 7th grade. And I said, I don't know what to do about this. And he didn't know either, which was not a great comfort to me. And I decided after that I just wasn't going to talk about it, that I was just going to wait until it went away, until everything was different.
And then I decided to go from this girl who was really afraid of men and was really flirtatious with guys and girls, and I went and I became like youth group girl. I was like, okay, so I'm gonna serve in the youth group. I'm gonna go to a Christian college. I'm gonna be an RA. I'm gonna be a small group leader. I'm gonna lead worship. I'm gonna do all the things for Jesus. Until my body started to break down.
I became suicidal, and God finally just kind of laid out for me that I was going to be okay somehow. And I went to my pastor, and with this confidence that I had felt God had given me, I went to my pastor and I said, look, this is something I'm battling. I don't know what to do with it. And I was escorted out of the church and invited to never come back. And I didn't. For 18 years, I didn't set foot in a church.
I can remember what it felt like to sit in that office and to be so afraid and to feel so hot and trembly, and to not even be able to look at my father or mother in the face, but to have to tell them this dirty thing that I was experiencing. And Mom and Dad responded, fully in character, which is to say, with love and grace. And they said, Drew, you're our son and we love you and it's okay. But they also said, we're going to help you to deal with this, and we're going to be able to get beyond this. We can fix this.
Up until that point, there had been denial. There had been not sure what path he's going to go down. We panicked. There was a lot of fear. We got Drew straight into counseling. We got him into ex-gay therapy, and those were mistakes we made.
One of the processes he and I were going through was, he in sharing, at least my faith was with me. We were walking together in this sense of, okay, this is who you are, this is how you experience your sexuality, but me expressing to him, I think God says no to gay sex, and that we need to think about how you can move through this in a way that you're still, honoring your Christian faith, God. And Drew was with me on that for several years, and we used to talk about that a lot.
That went on until about I was 17 years old, and at that time, two critical things happened that I think made a big difference. One was that I fell in love for the first time, and two, I went to Egypt for the summer. And in going to Egypt for the summer, I was exposed for the first time to a community, a country full of millions of people who believed something different than I did.
When he got back from Egypt, he had really experienced a lot of different things, seen a lot of different things. His view of the world had changed, his view of himself, his view of religion, his view of faith. And it was in that year when he said to us and to me, really, I'm done with the Christian faith. I don't believe this anymore, and I'm not going to go to church anymore. I'm gay, that's who I am, that's how I'm going to live, and you're just going to have to live with it. And I didn't respond very well.
I became hugely angry at my parents. I think also a tremendous amount of anger at myself came out, this anger that I had been wasting all this time, or it felt like that, trying to change myself into something I wasn't.
But, some things that happened during those years that were very important for our relationship is Drew really began to ask me some questions that forced me to get at this issue of, Dad, what are you really going to do with me as your son? I'm not the way you are. I don't believe the way you are. I don't think the way you do about morality. My life is not going to be what you want it to be. So what's going to happen to our relationship? And in a sense, I think Drew testing me and saying, are you still going to love me? Are you still going to stay with me? And we had to go through a lot of battles about that for a couple years.
But what I think made our relationship unique was that we didn't stay there. And despite all of those intense feelings between parents and child, we were committed throughout that whole process of those early years of me being out of the house to staying in relationship with each other, despite the fact that it was hard.
I see this as such a common response from evangelical parents of gay kids. It's as if they're looking at their gay kid and they say, in fact, sometimes they do, and say, you have destroyed my dream for you. And I look at that and I think, wait a minute, you've just made the situation about you. It isn't about you. It's about your son. It's about your daughter. It's not about your dream. And yet we have this way of really making this about us and about our pain, when in reality, as the parents of gay kids, it's impossible for us to even begin to understand the pain that they're dealing with. And that's the kind of thing that we need to pay attention to.
I went on to college and was in the Baptist Student Union there. They knew nothing about what had happened back at home, and I was on the executive council. I had gone to summer missions in a prison. And while I was there in summer missions, started dating one of the prison guards. And I would preach on Sunday morning and then go home to her. And I felt like this horrific hypocrite, and I didn't really know what to do, so I completely left the church. I left everything behind in my faith and started in theater, where being gay was completely accepted. And I met my wife, and she was unlike anyone I'd ever met before. We dated for 2 years, and were married for 6. She had a fatal disease, and we ended up having to pull the plug. And I called this church and spoke to the pastor. I will never forget his words. I asked him if he would consider doing Sue's funeral. I said, we're lesbians. I know you're a church, I know you're in Northampton, but would you do this for us? And I will never forget these words. He said I would be honored to.
Once I finally came to terms with the fact that it seemed like I was gay, and it seemed like no matter how much I prayed, God wasn't interested in changing that fact about me. So I sat down with my Greek New Testament and my commentaries and my lectures on YouTube, and I dared to think the unthinkable. I dared to ask the question that I had never dared to ask before, which was the question of whether the Bible might leave room for me to pursue a relationship with another guy. It was a very complicated question. It was more complicated than a lot of the well-meaning people in my life had made it seem. But I did end up concluding that there was also a best answer to the question, that there was a best way of reading the text, and that was a way that didn't leave space for me to pursue a relationship with another man. And so after a lot of wrestling, I decided to commit myself to a life of celibacy. And since then, it's been a long journey of figuring out what it looks like to be celibate in a way that is not living a life without love.
Every minute of every day, I wanted to be in a same-sex relationship with a woman. And I needed to just leave my hyper-religious community and move to one of the coasts where I could be free to be me. In that season, I met Matt. Whoa, left field. So we took a month to just pray. And I honestly, in that month that we were praying, I was just like, Jesus, I'm gonna tell him my story. And he was maybe the third person I was gonna tell. I was like, God, I could get majorly rejected right now. So as much as I could in my still broken heart, I told him my story, and he said, I don't see you any differently. And that just melted away so many defenses. And that was 8 years ago. People may look at our marriage and be like, how is that even possible? But there is a rich intimacy that comes with two hearts who are open and vulnerable and unafraid.
I always wanted a family, always wanted a wife and kids, and I felt like that was something that, if the right series of events happened, that, that could be my story, that could be real for me. And I didn't see my sexuality so much as an obstacle to that, which is kind of jarring probably to a lot of people today, and sometimes to myself even. And that happened. I actually fell in love with a woman, and we've been married almost 13 years now. It's not for everybody, I will say that. And I've met lots of people who have gone into mixed orientation marriages, and for various reasons it hasn't worked out, and there are heartbreaking stories. And so the biggest thing I wanted people to hear is that it is not the default solution. There are good and godly vocations and patterns of living and choices that have nothing to do with marriage that are wide open for gay people to pursue, and that can be life-giving.
By far the most people that I've encountered are folks who, on the one hand, want to affirm their love for me, but who also feel this great sadness at the thought that I won't be able to pursue a relationship that I desire. On the one hand, I'm touched by their sadness, and I appreciate their sympathy for what has been at times for me a really, really painful journey. But I also long for my brothers and sisters in Christ to find a place in their hearts to celebrate with me the opportunities that I have as a celibate gay Christian. There are so many glorious things that I get to be a part of. There are ways that I get to love people, that I get to serve, that I'm not sure I could do if I had a different story.
Honestly, 1 Corinthians 13 has to be the standard that we live by. Paul lays it out. Love is patient, kind, always protects, trusts, hope, perseveres, endures through every circumstance, and it rejoices when the truth wins out. God designed marriage to reflect himself in the church. And he is the perfect embodiment of male and female, and me and another woman don't perfectly embody that. So if you love me, you will call me into truth.
People talk about this issue in a way that makes it seem like they don't exist in the church. When you talk about something rather than to someone, it communicates, that they're not there. They might as well not be there. But I think that for us to know what change looks like, we need to take a really serious look at the way we talk about this issue in churches.
What brought me back to the church was, oddly enough, the church. The people of the church being what Christ designed the church to be. They would just treat me like a normal human being, which is not something I had really experienced in the church prior to that. So if you're really looking to reach into the LGBT community, the first thing to do is not look at it as the LGBT community, just look at it as people who need Christ.
There's this huge church-shaped hole in my life, this void, that I'm gonna have to figure out how to fill somehow. And I wonder if I'll ever find a place where I feel at home and where I feel comfortable. And I don't know that I will. But what I do know is that the people from the church where I grew up have continued to love me and pour into my life, despite the fact that they don't believe that my lifestyle is pleasing to God.
I feel like the best thing we ever did, because we did a lot of really not so good things, I have to admit, but the best thing we ever did is very simple. We have stayed in relationship with Drew. And we always will.
I want to talk to everyone and anyone about Jesus. But what I understand in terms of my relationship with my son and the LGBT community, his friends, that if I respond to them out of rejection and out of breaking relationship, I will never have the opportunity to talk to them about Jesus because they will have absolutely no interest. It's only when I engage with love and embracing people for who they are that I actually then have the opportunity to talk about Jesus.
We need to share Christ. We need to share love. We need to make sure people understand what the cross means and what that sacrifice means.
I think it's true of all of us that as we journey with God, it's going to be a journey, and it's going to have ups and downs, and it's going to be joyous, and it's going to be heartbreaking. And in the end, what we need in those times most of all is for folks to love us as we journey with Jesus. We don't need someone else to walk our journey with Jesus instead of us. What we need is for people to love us and encourage us along the way. And so that's what I need for my own journey with Jesus. I need people to love me. I need people to walk alongside me and to speak life to me, just as you do, just as any of us do as we pursue God together.